Hi, everyone. Hopefully, you can see and hear me well. So, a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, depending on where you are at the moment. My name is Hannah Swee, and I lead the Toolbox and Capacity Building activities for the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. You probably know us better as ICAT. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this webinar to launch the updated ICAT Renewable Energy Methodology. So just before we begin, I want to say a quick note on some of the practical aspects of this webinar and the platform that we're using. As you probably have noticed, you are muted with your camera off. So if you do have any questions or comments, you can submit them through the Q&A button that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the webinar, we'll have a few different opportunities to take your questions and answer them live. But you can use this function with the Q&A button at any time during the webinar to get in touch with us or to ask any questions. Also a note on interpretation. So this webinar will only be available in English. Sometimes there is a button that appears for interpretation on this platform, but please note that we do not have a formal interpretation option for this webinar today. So as I mentioned, today we are launching the update to the ICAT Renewable Energy Methodology. So this is one of the GHG impact assessment guides within the ICAT series of policy assessment guides. This guide has actually been consistently one of the most popular, most applied guides in ICAT's toolbox. And just looking, I think, in this webinar so far, I recognize some familiar names. Some of you who I know have also applied the guide in your countries. So with this update, we wanted to make the guide even more applicable for the needs of developing countries, looking at the different kinds of policies that are being planned and implemented right now, and also expanding the policy coverage of the guide to meet this. We also wanted to improve the usability of the guide. So in parallel, we have also updated the introductory guide for the entire series of policy assessment guides. So we'll hear a lot more about this throughout the webinar today, of course. In terms of the agenda, we will start with some remarks by Dr. Maged Mahmood, who is the Acting Executive Director, Technical Director and Senior Renewable Energy Consultant at the Regional Centre for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, or RCRE. This will then be followed by some remarks by Dr. Henning Wooster, the Director of ICAT. We will then have a presentation on the updated renewable energy methodology by Trupti Yagatimath, who is a project officer at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Centre, or UNEP CCC. So then there'll be some time for some questions before we move on to hear about an application of the renewable energy methodology, which was done in Eswatini. And this will be presented firstly by Dr. Nosifir Roswani, who is a lecturer at the University of Eswatini. And then followed by some reflections from Thembinkosi and Enzimanzi, who is the Senior Energy Officer at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy of Eswatini, and is also responsible for alternative fuels and climate change. And then finally, there will also be some additional time for questions and discussion before we have some closing remarks. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Maged Mahmood to say some opening words to start off this webinar. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and it's a pleasure being with you today, in this important webinar, and to speak to you on the role of renewable energy policies for climate actions. In fact, renewable energy policies act as the primary catalyst for translating global climate targets into concrete infrastructure investments and market shifts. So we speak about, for example, emission abatement as one of the major targets through cutting emissions and aligning national grids with the climate targets, phasing out of fossil fuels, but also for investment protection, deploying long-term contracts and auctions to lower financial risks for private clean energy capital. Also, we look into through policies into market rules and how to enforce renewable energy portfolio standards, for example, or carbon pricing mechanism to drive demand for clean alternatives. or to go for the policies also could be for the objective or to help for grid resilience, meaning that policies could be designed to modernize infrastructure, expand, for example, storage systems, battery energy storage system best to handle variable renewable energy resources such as wind and solar. And of course, the policies could target socioeconomic gains to boost our energy security, improve public health, reduce costs on the economy, drive green jobs, add value to the economy, etc. So renewable energy policies, in fact, have become the cornerstone for global climate actions. And the latest scientific literature, including the IPCC sixth assessment report, and also the data from the International Energy Agency and IRENA that were issued lately in 2026 and peer-reviewed empirical studies concluded that renewable energy policies are highly effective at reducing emissions, provided that the right conditions and ecosystems are there. Thus, success is not automatic. It requires good design of policy. And in fact, the lessons learned and that you will see in today's presentation also from different colleagues that we need a mix of instruments, not a single instrument. And there is no one size fits all approach that would, it is simply unsound to have such approach, one size fits all, or one policy would work. We have learned over the past 2 decades that success need dynamically adaptive policy portfolio, treating renewable not only as a standalone fix, but as a centerpiece of deep socio-technical system transformation. And when we discuss these issues, we can look into what we can call strategic positioning shift, meaning that we are speaking on renewable from an optional measure. It was as it was dealt before when we started this policy. I would say shift toward adopting more renewables in the systems toward a core pillar in the system. In fact, we can see that several reports, including issued by the ICAT, and the places renewables, storage, electrification, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, critical minerals, demand side measures, innovation system, and technology transfer as interdependent component of the system transition. So if we are looking for a systemic energy transition, we should look into this together. And renewable energy policies help to achieve these interconnections. And there are some insights that I would like to share with you over the coming 2 or 3 minutes. First of all, that the cost revolution has been a real accelerator for the market. Solar PV batteries costs have fallen 80% over the past 2 decades. Wind energy costs, electricity production and also installation, etc., were reduced by 30 to 40%. And in 2025 alone, 85% of the new power capacity additions globally were from renewable energy. So investments that were estimated when we started discussing the role of renewable 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the level of investment has not increased because of this dramatic reduction in the prices, in the cost of the systems. This means that with the same amount of money available, investments available, we can achieve higher impact. And this is one thing that, in fact, is due to the technology maturity and the economic maturity for wind and solar technologies in particular. Also, there is somehow a consensus, scientific consensus, that had matured over the policy development frameworks. So it has shifted from providing support to improving the technology feasibility at the early stages to addressing market barriers, and now to socio-technical systems and transition pathways. So the core question is no longer whether renewable would work, but under which conditions, what condition they can be scaled at sufficient speed and depth. And this framing directly informs policy design. When we think about the effectiveness of policy instrument, the empirical evidence would be that overall emission reduction effects are there. Several studies have proved the direct relation between reduction of emission and the scaling up renewable energy and the successfully implementing policy. But there are major policies that have proven successful, but some of them also after being tested, they are now no longer seen as suitable for the market. So the major policies that you will see also today in the presentation, we are speaking about policies like feed-in tariff, which was for long the strongest early stage deployment driver, providing price certainty to reduce risks, of course, on investment. But now it was highly successful, but now largely obsolete for in advanced market when we move into a competitive market. So this is transition from feed-in tariffs to auctions, to bidding, to other market mechanisms is a sign of a policy success. So it is not rigid that we go for a certain policy and stick to it. Markets are evolving towards competitive bids, auction for more transparency and price competitiveness. There are also instruments with varying degree of suitability based on the national contexts, such as net metering, renewable energy portfolio standards, carbon pricing, fiscal incentives, etc. And now the lessons that we have learned that combining supporting policies, making a portfolio of policies would work together. Would this mean that we would help us to accelerate the market uptake of renewable technology and achieve the target? Of course, the transition from one policy to other triggers also new policy frontiers. So shifting from, for example, stimulating deployment to integrating high shares of renewable means that we need to look more into modernizing grids, looking more into sector coupling, transport, heating, industry, etc., and ensuring policy credibility over the case, stability for the investors. Of course, we understand that this varies from one country to the other, but there are general, I would say, governing guidance that, for example, ICAT is providing through the excellent report that you will see today. And this would help countries to tailor the policy into what they could work with successfully. Another important insight that I would like to share with you is that policy effectiveness is conditional. There is a heterogeneity in the reality. So there is what we can say that we need to link the policies to specific development targets and thresholds. So below this threshold, the effect of policies may be insignificant or from the climate action perspective. And this could be due to technological deficits, fossil dependent industrial structures, weak governance. To explain, for example, when we look into high income countries, the policy objective should be oriented around aggressively scaling renewables and lead system integration. While if we are speaking about high energy intensity countries, the objective here will prioritize structural industrial transformation first as an objective rather than just scaling up renewable in general. And if you have very high intensity CO2 intensity countries, then the rule of law for enforcement on climate and environmental rules would come first here. So of course, there is a mix in each country, but these are things that highlight that we have differentiated pathways. They are clear, but we can adapt them to fit our local context. As we know, at COP28, nearly 200 national pledges for tripling global renewable energy capacity were there, and we believe this is achievable, but it requires the right policies and right ecosystem. With this, I think I consumed more than my 5 minutes. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm at your disposal later on after the colleagues present their own presentation to discuss and elaborate with you further. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Magid, for those remarks. And I think a really fitting way to start this webinar, highlighting the importance of energy policies, the very wide potential impacts of energy policies. And I think you also touch on the longer term outlook, the systems change, and the importance of having policies that are really effective, which I think really leads well to the next speaker. So I'm really pleased now to hand the floor over to Dr. Henning Rooster to say some words about the importance of impact assessment for renewable energy policies. So over to you, Henning.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and good afternoon, or maybe good morning to some of you, and perhaps good evening to a few of you. It's really encouraging to see so many connected and so much interest in this very important topic. Some of you may have been involved in preparing and submitting NDC 3.0 last year. This year, clearly, the focus is shifting to implementation, to look beyond targets, to actually look at action and results. It's not necessary to emphasize the urgency of accelerating climate action, but it's, I think, important to draw also the attention to the opportunity that climate action brings. And I think following from Margaret, who underlined how much renewable energy has evolved in the energy landscape, that opportunity with especially renewables is critical, and renewables are playing a central role in the energy transition. As Margaret very well explained and underlined, in order to reap that opportunity and to meet the requirements of the urgency in addressing climate change, effective policies are needed. While solar and wind, for instance, are cost-effective, scaling these technologies up requires well-designed policies and regulatory certainty and incentives. Success depends on delivering measurable results. It's not enough just to set targets. Evidence-based policies are the foundation of the energy transition. To meet the Paris Agreement goals, policies must be assessed, strengthened, and improved through a process that is based on a rigorous methodological approach. And that's why we are presenting to you the renewable energy methodology in a revised version today. So everybody knows climate action needs ambition, but I want to emphasize that ambition without measurement is a blind spot. Aspirational targets are necessary, but by themselves, they are insufficient to deliver the transformational changes required by the Paris Agreement. So policy assessment is not an academic exercise. It is a strategic asset. It is the mechanism that transforms climate promises into bankable, scalable realities. And what I want to talk about briefly is, first of all, the role of policy assessments. Secondly, some of the key aspects of the assessment process. And then thirdly, the renewable energy guide that we are presenting today as part of ICAT's series of policy assessment guides. So what are the roles of policy assessments? I want to highlight 5. First of all, enabling evidence-based policy. Assessments allow policymakers to make informed decisions as they can see the causal relationship between specific policies and their greenhouse gas impacts. These assessments are also important to identify barriers which need to be part of the policy-making process. For instance, for renewable energy, grid infrastructure is critical, or an understanding of the cost of electricity. Secondly, engaging the stakeholders in the sectors, in this case, in the energy sector, is absolutely critical. If implementing NDCs is done just by the Environment Ministry, it's not going to be successful. It requires engagement of the line ministries. And policy assessments actually provide the point of reference for the sectors. They are the place where the policies reside. Energy ministries are in charge of renewable energy policies, and they need to support this link to climate action and to understand the impacts of the policies that are implementing. While we will focus here very much on policy impact, I want to emphasize that the guide also offers the option to assess the cost of policies, and that is an important element of the process that I would encourage everybody to pursue. Third role of policy assessments, building credibility for investors. That, for me, may be actually the most important one. Evidence on impact reduces perceived risks for investors by demonstrating performance, and it unlocks the capital that is essential for infrastructure and implementation. ICAT has now implemented in several countries the climate finance transparency methodology. What resulted often was a stronger engagement by finance ministries and planning ministries, but they then often came with a request for more information on the impact of climate action. So they want to understand the impact of what they are supposed to contribute with financing. And that is, I think, a critical understanding. No financial institution will invest in any policy or climate action without understanding the results. And understanding means that it is documented evidence on the impacts of implementation. Fourthly, when we talk about NDCs, we should always keep in mind the NDC feedback loop. Policy assessment is the engine of the Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism. By evaluating what worked and what failed in implementing current NDCs, governments create the necessary foundation for the next more ambitious round of national contributions, the next round of NDCs. And it's not too early to get ready for NDC 4.0, which will just come in a couple of years. Fifthly and finally, I encourage use of the assessment methodologies to prepare for the just transition guardrails of the NDC. Assessments are critical to identify winners and losers. Besides greenhouse gas impact, they allow quantifying the socioeconomic impacts like job creation or public health improvements, and then proactively manage trade-offs to ensure an equitable shift towards net zero. So what are the key elements of the assessment process? First of all, let me underline that assessment is not a one-time audit. It should be embedded across the policy life cycle. It starts before implementation, ex ante, estimating the potential to ensure resources are targeted effectively and goals are realistic. That's a critical function feeding into policy design. Then, of course, it's something to do during implementation, midterm, at regular intervals, to monitor how the policy is advancing, what are the impacts, is everything on track. At that point, it's possible to identify operational bottlenecks or infrastructure gaps. And of course, to track and report on progress, and finally to enable course correction to ensure that targets are met in the end. And lastly, of course, after implementation, post-implementation, ex post, policy assessments help to evaluate final results to inform future recalibrations and scaling up, to evaluate, report, and very important, to learn from the implementation experience. What is critical is methodological rigor, and that's what the policy assessment guide offers. For instance, to start with a very solid building of scenarios, to understand the baseline scenario, what happens without the policy, in order then to compare it with the policy scenario to understand the impact of the policy. Very important, and I think Margit highlighted a few aspects, is to analyze interaction with the energy system. Modern energy systems are complex, and the assessment process must account for how new renewable capacity interacts with existing energy strategies. I want to repeat that it's critical for energy ministries to be engaged in this assessment process. And the third point I want to emphasize here is standardization. Rigor comes from consistency, and using the ICAT renewable energy methodologies will give that rigor. Governments can ensure by using the ICAT methodology that their assessments are comparable, transparent, and defensible. This signals quality to investors and partners, also when aiming to engage in cooperation under Article 6. So let me come to the guide, but I won't go into any details because we'll have a presentation following my intervention. But what is important that the guide provides a standardized tool set that allows the applicant, the user, to go step by step through a structured framework to analyze the most important renewable energy policies. What is also important is that this is a practical roadmap. It has been applied in several countries. Let me highlight that one or several of the ICAT policy assessment guides was used in more than 40 countries. And we will hear later on from Eswatini on their experience of using the guide. I want to also emphasize that the Renewable Energy Guide is part of a series of 10 guides. 5 of them cover greenhouse gas impact assessments in various sectors, like the renewable energy sector. 3 of them cover cross-cutting aspects, and 2 are process guides. As Hannah explained at the beginning, we are relaunching this renewable energy methodology together with a new introductory guide to give an overview and an introduction into the series. And I really recommend everyone to read that new introductory guide because it gives you a good understanding of the options and the possibilities, and also an understanding of what it entails to undertake the assessment. What is important is that the various methodologies, the different guides, can be applied together. 26 of the 40 countries that I mentioned that have applied ICAT assessment guides have actually applied more than one guide. This is obvious when you look at the cross-cutting guides. You may want to look at greenhouse gas impact together with sustainable development impacts. And there, the sustainable development methodology comes in critically. But also looking in parallel at the transformational change potential may be very important. I want to highlight that some funding mechanisms require transformational change in order for them to become a donor of a certain activity. So documenting the transformational change potential of policies and actions may become extremely important, and that can be done by the application of the transformational change methodology. Also, integrating action at subnational level or action by non-state actors is important to move to advance all the potential implementation options. And here, the non-state subnational action guide becomes a critical resource. And let me highlight also the 2 process guides. Stakeholder participation is absolutely key for any transparency process, but very critical for policy assessments. And the stakeholder participation guide is therefore a very important supplementary tool when implementing and applying the renewable energy methodology. The technical review guide is critical, especially when the main purpose of the exercise is to mobilize finance, because it helps to ensure rigor. It is essential if you want to document clearly that policy assessment has followed a standardized approach, and it helps you to ensure the quality of the assessment and thereby signal to investors the reliability of the assessment results. So the recommendation is to combine various ICAT assessment guides. And I won't go much further because we will have more details in the following presentations. But let me reiterate that leadership on climate action is defined not by the boldness of announcements, but actually by the rigor of evidence applied in implementing action. Policy assessment is a critical enabler of the energy transition, transforming climate ambition into concrete and successful action. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Henning, for these remarks. I think you've touched on so many aspects that really underpin the importance of doing impact assessments, not only for renewable energy policies, but I think much broader than this area. So I think in particular, the benefits that this kind of assessment and using the ICAT methodologies can represent for countries, and importantly, the role of measurement to make that ambition a reality. So the next presentation will now give a detailed overview of the updated guides, focusing on the renewable energy methodology, but also how it relates to the updated introductory guide. For this presentation, I'm pleased to introduce Trupti Yagatimmath from UNEP CCC, who have been our partner, our technical partner, leading the drafting and development of these guides. So just a reminder that if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of your screen. We'll take them after Trupti's presentation, but please feel free to submit them as we go along. So Trupti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Let me know when you can see my screen.
It's coming.
Yeah.
We see it, but not in full screen mode.
Okay, how about now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so thank you again, Hannah, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. My name is Trupti Yagatimmath, and I'm a project officer with the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Centre. And it's a pleasure to be here today to introduce the new ICAT introductory guide, as well as the updated renewable energy methodology that we have been working on for the past couple of years. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you find these guides useful and practical in supporting policy development and implementation in your respective countries. To start with a bit of background, which I think we are all very familiar with, climate change introduces an unprecedented challenge that requires rapid and far-reaching transformations across virtually all sectors and parts of society. And we can see the scale of this challenge in the latest emissions gap report, which estimates that global emissions need to fall by 55% in the next 10 years. And in this context, accelerating effective climate action and raising ambition is becoming more and more critical to ensure that emissions are being reduced and keeping us on track towards the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. This is where ICAT's resources can play an important role. ICAT supports countries in assessing the impacts of their policies and actions, and this will help strengthen transparency, effectiveness, and overall climate ambition. ICAT has developed a comprehensive set of methodologies to help countries assess the impacts of their climate policies and actions. And here we have the list of ICAT series of assessment guides, as Henning was just describing, and these show us how they are organized. So the series includes GHG impact assessment guides, which support the assessment of GHG impacts of policies and actions in various sectors, such as agriculture, renewable energy, buildings, transport, forest. And cross-cutting assessment guides provide methodologies for assessing sustainable development, transformational change, or the contributions of non-state and subnational actions. Finally, the process guides support stakeholder engagement and technical review. We also have the overarching introductory guide that has been developed, and this provides an overall framework for understanding and applying the assessment guides. Oh, sorry. Coming to the purpose and applicability of the guides, I think Henning elaborated these points already, so I'll keep this a bit brief. At the core, they provide consistent and transparent methodologies for assessing the impacts of climate policies. They provide clear understanding of expected impacts, costs, effectiveness, and they can also help policymakers design more effective and ambitious climate strategies. Most importantly, the guides can inform at all stages of policy development. So at the planning and design stage in the beginning, or an ex-ante assessment, it can help policymakers compare different options, estimate their expected impacts, and use this information to inform their policy design. During implementation, interim assessments could support to track key indicators, monitor progress, and see if there has to be any changes made to make sure the policy is being effective. Finally, once a policy has ended, an ex-post assessment looks at actual impacts achieved, evaluates the effectiveness of the policy, and captures the lessons learned. So the guides can support evidence-based decision-making throughout the entire policy cycle, and this can be crucial for mobilizing of finance by demonstrating the potential and results of effective policies. Finally, the methodologies can support both domestic and international reporting requirements under UNFCCC as well. And in the rest of the presentation, we'll take a look at some of the key highlights of the introductory guide as well as the renewable energy guide. Starting with the introductory guide, it is mainly organized into two parts. Part 1 provides an overview of the guides. It describes the purpose, the structure, the potential uses of all the guides in the series, and it explains how they relate to and support the objectives of the Paris Agreement, including the updating and implementation of NDCs. Part 2 covers the planning and conducting of assessments. So this part presents the common elements that apply across all GHG impact assessment guides. And this includes assessment quality principles, stakeholder engagement, setting of objectives, methodological considerations, etc. It also provides a guidance on cost estimation, monitoring, reporting, and finalizing of assessments. So throughout this introductory guide, users can find references are being provided to relevant specific guides in the series, allowing them to easily navigate between general and specific content. So in a nutshell, the intro guide provides the overall framework for understanding and applying the assessment guides. And it also gives users the overview of the full series of the ICAT assessment guides and provides a common foundation that can be used. Specifically, it introduces each policy assessment guide, outlines its scope and the types of policies it covers, and this can help users to identify which guide is the most relevant given their national context. It also explains how the guides are structured and relate to one another, and how they can be combined to support more comprehensive assessments. It also brings together key elements common to GHG impact assessment guides, including the purpose and scope of assessments, intended users, guiding principle, methodological considerations, alignment with ETF, and links to sustainable development goals. So now let's take a closer look at the renewable energy methodology. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the sector-specific GHG impact assessment guides in the series. and it provides policymakers with practical methodological guidance to assess the GHG impacts of renewable energy policies, and also helps them understand the factors that influence the implementation and ultimately assess how renewable energy deployment could translate into emission reduction. As Mahit was also mentioning earlier, we know that renewable energy has significant potential to reduce emissions by replacing fossil fuel-based energy generation, and it is expected to play a major role in achieving emission reductions in the coming decades. So against this backdrop, it is important to assess the impact of renewable energy policies in a consistent and transparent way, and to understand whether they are delivering the expected results and contributing to national and global climate objectives. So the methodology supports policymakers in doing exactly this. So it can help them assess and strengthen the effectiveness of renewable energy policies, while also providing information that can support reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. Here we have the list of policies that are covered by the guide. There are, of course, many different renewable energy policies that have been adopted and successfully implemented across the world. However, in this guide, we focus on 5 of the most widely used policies. And for each policy, we have provided examples and practical guidance on how the different steps in the methodology are organized, so the users can better understand how the overall assessment process works. So the 5 policies that are covered are feed-in tariffs, which provide renewable energy producers with a guaranteed price for the electricity that they supply to the grid. Then we have auction and tender policies, which use competitive bidding processes to procure renewable electricity. And usually the most competitive offers wins the bid from project developers. Then we have the tax incentive policies, which provides tax benefits or incentives to support the installation and operation of renewable energy projects. Then the net metering and the VRE policies are the latest addition to this guide. So the net metering policy allows electricity consumers who also generate their own energy to feed excess back into the grid. And for this, they would typically receive a credit. And finally, the variable renewable energy integration policies support technologies and system upgrades, such as battery storage, for example, to help integrate variable renewable sources such as solar and wind into the electricity system. One important point to note is that the policies and methodology that we have presented in the guide applies mainly to electricity that is being fed into the grid. The RE methodology has been organized into 3 main parts. Part 1 begins with planning the assessment, which includes a brief overview of reporting frameworks, stakeholder engagement, policy objectives, and methodological considerations that are relevant to the sector. And it can help users identify policies that are applicable to their context, including an overview of policy types and the scope of the methodology. Then it moves on to part 2, which supports users in clearly describing the selected policy, identifying intermediate effects and potential GHG impacts, how to develop a causal chain, defining assessment boundary and period, all of this while taking into account interactions with other policies. And finally, in part 3, we have presented the core of the methodology, which includes steps to estimate the addition of renewable energy, GHG impacts for both ex ante and ex post assessments, how to estimate the cost of policy implementation, etc. So basically, this guide can be used at various stages of the policy cycle, and we will take a look at few of the highlights in the following slides. So here we start with defining the policy, the causal chain, and the GHG assessment boundary. And this step basically sets up the foundation for the entire assessment. We begin by clearly defining the policy that is being assessed and identifying the key intermediate effects through which the policy is expected to influence the emissions. These relationships are then mapped through the causal chain, which links policy actions to resulting emission outcomes. The methodology also guides users in defining the appropriate assessment boundary and time frame, including whether the assessment will be ex post, ex ante, or whether you want to estimate the impacts beforehand or to assess actual impacts that have been achieved after the policy has been implemented. Finally, it will look at how the policy interacts with other policies and measures, including synergies and trade-offs. So this is important because these interactions can influence not only GHG outcomes, but also sustainable development objectives and broader transformational change. And in the next few slides, we will take a brief look at these shortly. Yeah. So starting with defining the policy to be assessed. To carry out an effective impact assessment, it is important to first have a clear and detailed understanding of the policy being assessed. And to support this, the methodology provides a checklist of key information that we can see on the slide here. And this includes, for example, the type of policy instrument. This could be auctions or tenders. What are its objectives? Details regarding its implementation, the sectors and GHG gases that are being affected, as well as other relevant policy characteristics. So together, this information helps clearly define the policy and provides a solid foundation for the assessment that will follow. Next, we have to identify the intermediate effects of the policy, which lead to GHG impacts, and use these to develop the causal chain. For most renewable energy interventions, the main impact is either the displacement of emissions from existing fossil fuel plants or the avoidance of emissions from new fossil fuel capacity that would otherwise have been built. So for these more standard interventions, the guide provides a standardized impact identification framework to make the assessment more efficient while still maintaining a clear audit trail. At the same time, the methodology highlights when it is important to engage relevant stakeholders to identify intermediate effects. This could include, for example, changes in behavior, in technologies, in processes, or practices that would ultimately lead to GHG impacts. The final step is to develop the causal chain, which maps the sequence of cause and effect relationships, showing how the policy ultimately leads to GHG impacts. And in the slide here, you can see a generic example of how a causal chain would look like. Next, we need to define the assessment period, which is the period over which the impacts of the policy will be assessed. The appropriate time frame would depend largely on the status of the policy and whether we are conducting an ex ante or an ex post assessment. As I mentioned earlier, if the policy is still being planned but not yet implemented, it will generally be an ex ante assessment, and it will focus on the expected impacts in the future. If the policy has already been implemented and is ongoing, we can conduct an ex post assessment to understand the impacts achieved to date, or an ex ante assessment to estimate future impacts, or we can do a combination of both, which can be useful for monitoring progress and identifying whether any adjustment or course correction is needed at this point. And finally, you can also have an ex post assessment, which will identify how well the policy performed over its time frame. So in simple terms, ex post looks at the impacts achieved so far, and ex ante looks at the expected future impacts, and a combined assessment will look at both. The next part focuses on estimating the renewable energy deployment resulting from a policy, primarily using an ex ante approach. The idea here is to start by looking at the technical potential and then gradually consider the different factors that could affect how much of that potential can actually be achieved. The methodology provides a 4-step approach for estimating the renewable energy additions, and the 4 steps essentially take us from the technical potential through to policy design, financial feasibility, and finally to the non-financial barriers that may limit the deployment. However, it is important to note that not everyone needs to apply all 4 steps. It is very dependent on the purpose of the assessment and how much analysis has already been carried out. For example, if a country is assessing an existing policy against an NDC target that has already been defined, the technical potential may not need to be assessed separately, as this analysis may have already been reflected in the target setting process. So similarly, if a country has already carried out a comprehensive analysis of policy design, financial feasibility, and barriers when developing the NDCs, some of these other steps could also be skipped. However, it is very rare to find such comprehensive analysis already prepared. So in such cases, the methodology recommends focusing on the remaining barriers that could affect renewable energy. And steps 2 to 4 can be also considered together. This approach is also useful for course correction during policy implementation. If an ex post assessment shows that a policy is not achieving its intended objectives, these steps can be revisited to identify whether changes are needed in the policy design, financial conditions, or measures to address remaining barriers. Finally, for a new policy that is still being designed, the recommendation would generally be to apply all 4 steps to develop a more robust estimate of the renewable energy deployment that the policy could potentially achieve. The methodology here essentially helps users move from what could theoretically be deployed to what renewable energy deployment can we reasonably expect this policy to achieve. Next, we have the estimation of GHG impacts of the policy as part of the ex-ante assessment. So the purpose here is to take the renewable energy additions we estimated in the previous section and translate them into expected GHG emission reductions over the assessment period. There are 2 main approaches here which can be used, which is the emissions trajectory method and the grid emission factor method. The choice between them will depend on various factors such as the characteristics of the power system, level of renewable energy penetration, availability of data, capacity of the personnel, etc. So before choosing an approach, we first need to define 2 scenarios. The baseline scenario, which will represent what is expected to happen without the policy in place, and the policy scenario, which represents what is expected to happen with the policy in place. And the difference between emissions between these 2 scenarios gives us the GHG impact, which we can attribute to the policy. Once these scenarios are established, we can select the most appropriate method for estimating the GHG impacts. The trajectory method, for example, looks at how emissions are expected to evolve over time based on the projected electricity generation mix. It incorporates the renewable energy additions estimated earlier and considers how these additions affect the overall power system. In the second approach, which is the grid emission factor method, this simple approach assumes that renewable energy that is being generated displaces the electricity from other sources on the grid. So the GHG reduction is then estimated using an emission factor that represents the electricity generation that is being displaced. So in simple terms, the emission trajectory method looks at how the electricity system and its emissions are expected to evolve, while the grid emission factor method focuses on the emissions associated with the electricity that is displaced by renewable energy. So throughout this step of the methodology, the guide provides practical support for carrying out the entire assessment. This includes guidance on what data would be required, how to find it, where to find benchmarks, how to select the appropriate modeling tools, and how to deal with different methodological choices, which will be very important once the assessment gets ongoing. Finally, we have the overview of estimating GHG impacts of a policy if you're using an ex post approach. So unlike in the ex-ante assessment, which is based on projected energy deployment, an ex post assessment looks at what actually happened. So it uses observed data during or after policy implementation to estimate the renewable energy additions achieved and the resulting GHG impacts. So there are 3 main objectives for this type of assessment. The first is to compare the results achieved with the policy targets. For example, we can compare the actual GHG emissions with relevant sectoral targets if they exist. The second would be to compare the actual results with the baseline scenario. And in this case, we want to understand what would have happened in the absence of policy. So we can develop a baseline that assumes the same amount of electricity that would have been generated, but using a non-renewable or business as usual scenario. Other conditions such as economic trends have to be kept consistent in this case. And then we can then compare the policy scenario with the baseline to estimate the GHG impacts that can be attributed to the policy. And the final objective is to compare actual results with what was projected in the ex-ante assessment. So this will allow us to see how the policy has been performing, whether or not it was performing as expected. So if the achieved renewable energy additions are higher than the projections in the ex-ante assessment, this could indicate that the policy was performing well. And it could also be potentially because of some complementary or supporting policies. On the other hand, if the deployment has been slow or lower than expected, it could indicate that the policy has been less effective than anticipated, or that other factors or policies have limited its impact. So this comparison is particularly useful because it allows us to learn from what actually happened. It can also help identify policy interactions and overlaps, avoid double counting of emissions, and also improve the assumptions used in future ex-ante assessments. So overall, the ex-post assessment is not just about measuring results. It also provides an important opportunity to learn from implementation and improve future policy design as well, which is very critical. So I think that was it for my presentation, and I'll stop here. But I hope this has given you a quick overview of each of the guides and key elements that they cover. And before we close, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has contributed to the development of these guides and helped shape it along the way. Special thank you to Ivana and Jyoti, our lead authors, for their tremendous work for developing this guide. And of course, a big thank you to our colleagues in ICAT for their reviews, for their expertise and their feedback. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and strengthening the guide. So thank you, everybody, for being part of the process. And over to you, Hannah.
Great. Thanks, Tripti, for the presentation and the overview of the guides. So I think Henning mentioned earlier the role of robust technical methodologies for policy impact assessment. And what your presentation, I think, has shown is how the ICAT methodologies, and in particular, we're looking today at the renewable energy methodology, translate these very technically robust processes into very clear steps that are easy to follow. So we have the introductory guide, which provides that very concise overview of what the GHG impact assessment process entails. So you can very quickly see that process, and then the sector-specific guides like the renewable energy methodology that then provide the more detailed areas for the sector, for the specific sector. So what you can see on the slide here are some QR codes. So these go directly to the ICAT website and the pages for the policy impact assessment guides. So for the renewable energy methodology, we'll have that coming up in the next couple of days. And just to note that everyone who has registered for this webinar today will receive it via email. So we've also been very aware, I think, throughout this process, and I think over the many years that we've had these impact assessment guides, that the usability aspects is a very important part. So with this update, we've also developed a range of comprehensive supporting materials. So we also have capacity building modules, templates, technical supplement, as well as case studies and end-to-end examples, which we'll also hear about actually very shortly in this webinar. But that is all available as well, together with the guide, to facilitate the application of the guide. So before we move on, I think with the webinar, I can see that there are a couple of questions that have come through. So at this point in time, if you do have a question, you can feel free to raise your hand and we can also unmute you. But I think we can start with some of those questions that have come through the Q&A function. So the first question that we have here, it says, you emphasized, so this is particularly for Henning, but I think other panelists can also come in. So you emphasized that policy assessment should help transform climate targets into bankable, scalable investments. From your experience in countries, what are the minimum conditions needed to make the ICAT methodology effective? And how can regional institutions such as RCRE help countries build those capacities and translate the assessment results into actual investment decisions? So Henning, let me hand over to you for that question, and then we can open the floor to other panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I'm happy to respond. I mean, what the assessment guides help as an essential part of making renewable energy projects bankable is to identify and document impact. And as I emphasized, financial institutions really require that documented assessment of results, and they need to have an estimate before they engage. And of course, they will monitor this and have to assess it during and after the implementation. So that's sort of the critical focus. And here, as I said, the technical review ensures the first of all, the standardized approach, and secondly, the quality that is required by financial institutions. Of course, making projects bankable has other elements to it, and it requires technical skills from the energy sector that where I think an institution like RCRE can really add value. I mean, ICAT has initiated collaboration with RCRE, and we work with RCRE to have more active engagement of energy ministries, because as I also emphasized several times, that the engagement of energy ministries is absolutely critical. And so while ICAT traditionally supports environment or climate ministries in countries, we also have been working with line ministries, agriculture, transport, or energy ministries. And this is something that we can then do very well together with RCRE, so that this application of the methodology becomes more widely and actually helps to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy.
Great. Thanks, Henning. Did anyone else want to come in terms of the other speakers? Otherwise, we can also, there's also another question, and I'll just see if anyone else has their hand up. Okay. So we have a question that says, are these guidelines being implemented somewhere? If yes, what was the outcome, success, or otherwise? Maybe Henning, let me turn back to you to answer that one as well.
Well, I think the next speaker will speak to that. That's the example of Eswatini. So you'll hear it directly from one of the countries that applied them. I think we've had other examples. I mean, Namibia was one of the recent applications where a feed-in tariff was assessed, and they identified that the feed-in tariff was not delivering as much as initially expected, and it was not delivering as much as required to meet the NEC targets. And they identified through the assessment process some of the barriers that prevent scaling up renewables with a feed-in tariff that is sufficient. And one of them was the challenge in the grid infrastructure. And I think those are important aspects to understand, learn, and then, of course, address, because they can be addressed through investment, and they are having and documenting that assessment also, again, coming back to the earlier point, helps then approaching investors or financial institutions that can offer support. I think we had an application in Zimbabwe, and there one of the results was that the renewable energy policies were effective in scaling up renewables, but they were not as effective as anticipated in mobilizing jobs and creating jobs in the country. And again, that could be addressed, and there were ways of addressing it. So, I mean, perhaps these two examples are good, but I do think we have had quite a few applications, and since renewables is one of the very effective ways of mitigation and of meeting emission reduction targets in the NDCs, the application has been quite widely, and I should emphasize that all reports from ICAT projects are available on the ICAT website.
Great, thanks, Henning. And I can just see one hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself? Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Ready?
Hello, Golden. Can you you are unmuted now.
How are you, ma'am?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead with your question.
Yes. No, my question is based on the issue of the climate change. Can it be used for the issues of the curriculum in the school, that it could also relate with the assessment studies that need to be addressed in terms of the education syllabus, because the ICAT framework that relate with assessment, it is one of the good program that it should be also amendment as a curriculum, that the students should also read and learn the manner in which the system is being addressed. That's what I wanted to relate in terms of the question.
Thank you. Maybe you can clarify which curriculum, at which level you're referring to.
Yeah, my clarification in terms of the curriculum, maybe from in South Africa, we could say is grade 6, where after the primary level, they start from the secondary level, is grade 6. Maybe we could, because they start in terms of understanding from a grade 6, a child, student can start to understand. Maybe it could be in terms of classification to a certain unit standard that could also suit the level of participation of those children, so that we have more intellectual people for future generation that will deal with the issue of the 2030 agenda and the issue of the renewable energy in a proper professional way, by putting those education principles to the early child development framework from grade 6. And thanks.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. I think that you brought up a very important point. I'm just in the interest of time, let's take a note of this, and then could we head to the next presentation, and then we will have some more time at the end to come back and respond to those questions. But we are noting them down. So just in the interest of time, I can see that time is flying. So maybe if I could just move on to the next speaker. who is Dr. Nosifiwe Zwane from the University of Eswatini, to present on the experience of applying the ICAT Renewable Energy Methodology in Eswatini. So this application of the guide, it's also included as one of the case studies that is included in the update. And it really represents a very strong example, I think, of doing a policy impact assessment for renewable energy policy and also the usefulness of the results from the assessment. So over to you, Nosifiwe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nosifiwe Zwane. I'll be giving the country a report of what we got when we were using the ICAT guide for renewable energy assessments. This work was done in collaboration with Professors Smiso Mkhonda, Temko Sinzimanze, and Dr. Bina Mavimbela. Next slide, please. Yes, so the talk, I'll briefly go over the overview of energy in Eswatini, just to give you a background of why we need renewable energy. And then I will give a summary of the policy that we will be assessing, and then the objectives of the assessment. And then at last, I would conclude with the results of the work that was done. Next slide, please. Is for Eswatini, most of the energy is exported from South Africa and Mozambique. So you can see from the graph that is shown over here, from 2018 to 2023, about 70% was imported. So Eswatini is currently facing an issue of energy insecurity. And next slide, please. And the problem is further highlighted by the increase in the electrification rate. So from 2000 to 2023, there has been 80% electrification rate, which is from the 20% that was in 2000. So that this means that the energy demand for the country has greatly increased, while we still greatly rely on the imports. So Eswatini is looking to generate more energy locally so that it has energy security, but it also wants to have more renewables as part of the energy that is being generated. Next slide, please. So this is a photo of the King of Eswatini just opening one of the power plants. So the country, there is a strong political commitment to deploying the renewable technologies. Next slide, please. So this just highlights the Eswatini's commitment to low energy economy. So this can be seen in several documents or policies in Eswatini. The National Development Plan maps out the need for energy security, and it emphasizes on having a lot of renewable technology being deployed. And the revised national determined contributions, which is the NDC for 2021, it also has a lot of renewable energy commitments. And then we have the National Energy Policy, which is the one that was assessed using the ICAT tool, which states that the government will support the development of local renewable energy sources for a target of 50% of the energy mix in the electricity generation. And maybe to highlight, when we get to the GHG emissions, the country, in securing its energy or having security energy, it is planning to have a 200 megawatt coal plant. So the renewable energy that will be introduced into the energy mix will be decreasing this capacity or the use of a coal plant. So then decreasing the GHG emissions. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the renewable energy policy assessment was to estimate the GHG impact of Eswatini renewable energy policy, to assess the policy efficiency by determining whether the national energy policy is delivering the intended results on the renewable energy electricity generation, and to improve policy implementation by determining whether the electricity policy statements are being implemented as planned, and then to also inform policymakers how the renewable energy policy implementation can be improved. And lastly, to build local capacity on application of ICAT tools for policy assessment. Next slide, please. So this slide just summarizes the implementation of the policy. So the policy statement is government will support the development of renewable energy sources for targets of 50% of energy mix in the electricity generation. And it will be implemented through the energy regulator by adding RE electricity to national grid through tender or energy auctions. So the procurement schedule is guided by the energy plan. Next slide, please. So the methodology that was used was one, it was data collection, where we reviewed the energy master plan and related documents. And then two was to the application of the ICAT guide through developing a causal chain, and then using the ICAT guide to moderate the capacities that were found in the master plan, using the barriers that are in the ICAT guide or the ICAT 2, and then LEAP was used to determine the GHG impacts. And then the third step was peer review process, where presentation of the results to focus groups of the energy experts drawn from key stakeholders in the energy sector was done. Next slide, please. So this is the causal chain for the policy. So you have 50% 50% renewable energy that you want to have in the energy mix. For that, the country is planning to have auctions for renewable energy, and that will increase MR IPPs. So for the auctions, the auctions will be different for the different technologies. So you have increase in solar PV electricity. So for each of these technologies, since there will be decreasing the use of the coal power plant, it means there will be decreasing the GHG emissions. So that is why you have the blue arrow there to the blue box, which is the reduction of GHG emissions. And then for the different technologies, for example, in the solar PV, you will be clearing virgin land sometimes to install the solars. So that will have an impact, which will be the increase in GHG emissions, because you are cutting down a virgin, or you're clearing a virgin land. And same will happen with the depth, but with which is you'll be increasing your sink. So then you will be reducing GHG emissions again. So that is the causal chain that we had for the GHG emissions. But for each action or each box, you could have also social and economical impacts, which you need to do a different causal chain. For example, if you increase solar PV electricity, you will be employing people, so that will be job creation. So that will be a job creation. So that is a social impact. So you'll have to have a different causal chain for that one. Next slide, please. So these are the social and economical impacts that we got. Because of time, I'm just going to name a few, which will be the land use change, air quality improvement. Can we go to next slide? So in this slide, in the first column, we have the technology, and the second column, we have the capacity for the different technologies as it appears in the master plan. And then we used the ICAT guide using both the technical and financial barriers. So then the capacities decreased. For example, for hydro, it decreased from 181.5 megawatts to 65.52 megawatts. And then the last column is where we had the experts who are really on the ground, who know the barriers that exist, telling us what they think the possible capacity will be by 2030. That is what we have in the third column. You can say that the results from ICAT guide don't differ much from the results from the expert, meaning that the guide worked very well. It is just a bit different or off for biomass. The reason there might be because the 120 megawatts that went into the master plan was coming from work that was done from the bioenergy policy, where we had already done the policy assessment. So maybe here we had done the policy assessment twice for the biomass. So maybe that is why it's a bit off from what the expert would think. Next slide, please. So here we have the results for the years from 2017 to 2030. So we have the business as usual, which is the plot that we have right now, where we have not deployed any renewable energy. So to cover the country energy demand or electricity demand, which is the yellow line there, you use quite a lot of coal. Next slide, please. So these are results from a renewable energy one scenario, which is where you have used the ICAT guide to make the adjustments. So here you see that you have deployed quite a lot of your renewable energy technologies and less coal. So you require less coal to meet your energy demand. Next slide, please. So this one shows the avoided emissions by using the renewable energy. So for renewable energy one scenario, which is where you have used the ICAT guide, you have avoided emissions of 572, which is 42%. And for renewable energy 2, which is where only the numbers from experts was used, it's 658, which is 49% reduction. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways here is the ICAT methodology provides a valuable framework for assessing the impact of renewable energy policies, and the ongoing implementation of Eswatini renewable policy has potential to significantly reduce GHG emissions. And these results were also used in updating the NDCs. And then the Eswatini government needs to periodically embark on policy assessments. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Nosifiwo, and also to the entire University of Eswatini team. I know you had many colleagues as well who were part of this project. So on this note, I want to also invite Thembinkosi Nzimanze from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy of Eswatini to also share some reflections, because the results of this assessment that was done by the University of Eswatini, it was, I know, of particular interest at the national level, and particularly for policy development and the NDC process. So let me hand over to Thembinkosi. The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. My colleague has done as the justice, most pure, but another guy, Mr. Henning, is the one who actually gave the whole background as to how this tool works. So I'm not going to explain how it works because he did a very good job on that one, on the assessment guide and what it does. Just like Dr. Nospiwe has actually elucidated, we used it and we used it we worked on it first on our NDC 2.0, and then we also worked on it as we moved forward, because what we found about the guide is that it is a structured tool for evaluating renewable energy policies, and also like the earlier colleagues have already alluded to the fact that it allows for accounting for barriers to implementation, financial barriers, as well as other barriers. So it supports the evidence-based planning, which is actually what we were looking for as government. Because the methodology is robust and it's adaptable, since it can be applied for both the ex-ante and ex-post assessments, like the other lady said here when she was, the other speaker said. So it helped us to realize, for instance, that our national energy policy, which we last reviewed in 2018, is about 8 years ago. So it is due for review. We were actually helped by this particular assessment so that it can come up and be up to date with current trends in the energy space. It also helped us as government to translate assessments insights into actionable policies, because sometimes you find that we have just put the targets, but only to find that they are not actionable. So that doesn't help. So it helps us to prioritize investments and also incentives, especially on the energy efficiency and other RE technologies. And it also aligns with the national and sectoral development goals for power procurement. So Dr. Nospiwe is alluded to our NDC 2.0 and its mitigation measures and how this tool was working on them. So in a nutshell, it helped us to guide our NDC as we were setting our targets for renewable energy deployment, and it was also able to help us to quantify our GHG mitigation potential, because prior to our being exposed to this tool. And the other thing is that the same team that worked on this tool is actually working on the greenhouse gas inventory for Eswatini, the greenhouse gas inventory report. So it's so this one was actually able to help us now to quantify our mitigation potential, and also it helped us to inform the sectoral strategies, even as the energy sector. It has already been stated that the NDC cycle, is a revolving one. So we anticipate that with the knowledge that we got from this tool, now we will continually be, fine-tuning our mitigation targets, and also as we continue to improve and enhance and use the data to update our commitments and ensure transparency as well as accountability in terms of what we are doing. So target setting will help us to be realistic. So we will now come up with realistic targets because of the use of this tool. I haven't laid eyes on the new improved version, but I do believe that it's going to help us, to even do things better. So in conclusion, I can say that as a ministry, the tool played a critical role in providing the information needed for preparing reports under the Paris Agreement's enhanced transparency framework, and as well as the SDGs, and the ICAT guide was able to provide us with systematic framework for continuously monitoring and evaluating our NDC as a country. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those reflections, Semunkosi. And I think, obviously this is a really strong case study that shows the application of the guide and some of the ways that the results can be used. Just to highlight again that this example that was presented on Eswatini, it's included as a detailed case study in the updated guide. So, so if you want to have a look, it's definitely there in detail, including all of the steps that were taken. So we were supposed to have a little bit of time for a Q&A, and maybe we can just very, very quickly take one more question. I know there was the question just before on curriculum, for school curriculum and the application of the guides for that. So I think this very much depends on what the curriculum is focused on. I can say that at a university level, we have had several universities that have integrated parts of the policy impact assessment and further ICAT materials into their university's curriculum. But I think very much it's so much on a case-by-case basis. So happy to take this conversation later. If Golden, you'd like to write in, and then we can see what your context is. I think we have one raised hand that I cannot see. Apologies, I cannot see the raised hands anymore. Yes, perhaps one more raised hand from Abdullahi. I can see you have your hand raised. Yes, you're unmuted.
I'm not sure I've been unmuted. Is it me or Abdullahi?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I can very quickly ask my question. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. My first question is regarding capacity building for a lot of national secretariats to not only work on the ICAT guides, but also prepare for NDCs. With a lot of the work, I'm wondering what the linkage between these guides and the support that ICAT provides and GEF and GCF funding to enable countries prepare for this. In supporting countries to prepare for NDCs and long-term development plans, LT-LEDs, we notice a huge gap in capacity, and there's a huge bureaucratic burden that's put on a lot of developing countries to fill in these documents to have access. Does ICAT also provide capacity on that? And the second question I had was regarding how ICAT also accounts for the informal economy. when preparing this guide? It's things like informal cooking, informal economy. How are in countries where it's difficult to estimate actual carbon emissions, how are these integrated into the guides? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So maybe just very quickly, let me turn to Henning, if you'd like to answer the first question, and then Tripti, perhaps you could answer the second.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, ICAT does support capacity building in getting ready for developing NDCs and implementing NDCs. And I need to expand perhaps to explain that for us, transparency includes all the data and analysis and the analytical capacity that comes with it to actually prepare modeling assessments that should, in our view, be the foundation for the NDCs. First of all, for setting targets in the NDCs, then developing an NDC tracking framework, and then turning NDCs into an implementation where the policy assessments that we presented here today are central. So I encourage you to have a look at our website. There you get a good overview of the different types of activities that are supported through ICAT country projects.
Thanks, Henning. And then perhaps Tripti, you can answer the second question.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to also add that we have been doing trainings with Botswana, and we have one coming up next week as well. So we do training of trainers, which has been, I think, quite widely requested with ICAT. So yeah, it has been interesting to work directly with countries and support their policy design and implementation process. But sorry, could you please repeat the second question?
Yes, thank you, Tripti. The second question was regarding how it calculates the contribution of the informal economy to carbon emissions.
The contribution of what? Sorry?
The informal economy. So in a lot of countries, it's very difficult to have data on emissions because first and foremost, it's very difficult to calculate, even in the formal economy. But in the informal, it's even more when you have burning vegetation, you have informal cooking. So how do you integrate this into the guide?
I understand now. Thank you for clarifying that. And so when you look at the guidance, there is, of course, different methodological considerations that are taken into account. So one of the aspects that the guide also considers is a scenario where there is not enough data that is available. And the guides will support the users and point them towards, for example, global benchmarks, or if there are any regional benchmarks that have been verified and published, you can use that instead as a basis when you're conducting your modeling and developing your scenarios in case there is no high quality data available in the country. So it is still possible to use the guide to develop these policy assessments. It's just that you will be relying on some of these other global standards instead.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yes, again, I think just to reiterate what Henning mentioned, we have a lot of material, I think, on the ICAT website as well to support these kinds of trainings and capacity building. But please always feel free to get in touch if there's a specific, request that you're looking at, and we can see how we can, support with that. So I don't see any other hands up. So, and I know that we're at time now. So I would really like to extend a big thank you, I think, to all the speakers today, all the presentations. Thank you, particularly Tripti and Magid, Nosifiwo and Thembinkosi, and of course Henning for your contributions today.